Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. I see some familiar names popping up. We're just going to give everyone a few minutes to enter the room to get comfortable. And thanks so much for joining us tonight for our CMT Connect webinar on SORD Deficiency. So my name is Estella Lugo. I am the Program Development Manager for the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation. And tonight's webinar is going to be all about SORD deficiency. We're going to give everyone an update and help everyone understand how SORD deficiency is currently being managed, learn about sorbitol and the role that it plays in SORD deficiency. We're also going to help identify the steps to take if you would like to be tested for SORD deficiency. Dr. Shoshana Schendelman is going to be sharing the research that is currently underway and discussing opportunities on how to participate in the clinical trials. And then we're going to hand it over to live Q&A. So feel free at any point during Dr. Shoshana Schendelman's presentation to enter your questions into that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there. And we'll be dedicating the last 20 minutes or so to answering those questions for everyone. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Shoshana Schendelman, founder and CEO of Applied Therapeutics. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks very much, Estella. Okay, so why don't we get started? As Estella said, tonight we're talking about SORD deficiency. So probably the first question is, what is SORD deficiency? So it's a progressive and debilitating form of hereditary neuropathy that affects both peripheral nerves and motor neurons. And it results in a significant level of disability. Patients lose their mobility and motility and daily functioning. It's an autosomal recessive genetic disease, which is caused by mutations in the SORD gene. And we'll talk about what SORD is in a second and what that gene is responsible for. But because it's autosomal recessive, that means that in order to develop this disease, you actually have to have 2 copies of a mutated SORD gene, one from each parent. And so, you know, it's a rare disease for that reason. There's about 3,000 patients, a little bit more than 3,000, about 3,300 patients in the US with SORD deficiency and close to 4,000 in Europe. The average age of onset is 17 years old. But early symptoms often appear around adolescence, and we'll talk more about what those symptoms usually are. And as is the case, unfortunately, for many rare diseases, there are currently no drugs approved to treat SORD deficiency. One of the things we'll be talking about a little later is a clinical trial that's ongoing right now for a potential drug, an investigational drug to treat SORD deficiency. So patients with SORD deficiency are unable to convert glucose to sorbitol. So what does that mean? We all use glucose as a source of energy, and we primarily utilize one pathway called the hexokinase pathway to metabolize glucose, or to break down glucose into energy that we can use for our body to function. But there's another pathway, an alternative pathway for glucose metabolism called the Polyal Pathway. And so in normal individuals, a very small amount of glucose goes through this pathway. So only about 1% of our glucose is metabolized through the Polyal Pathway. And that pathway uses 2 enzymes. One called aldose reductase that converts glucose to sorbitol, and then a second enzyme called sorbitol dehydrogenase, or SORD, converts that sorbitol into fructose, which is then used for energy production. So in people on a daily basis, a really small amount of glucose goes through this pathway. But some patients with SORD deficiency are actually missing this enzyme sorbitol dehydrogenase because they have genetic mutations on the DNA that encodes for that protein. And so if you don't have that enzyme sorbitol dehydrogenase, even though a very small amount of glucose is going through this pathway, that sorbitol has nowhere to go. And it builds up to very high levels in the blood and tissues and in neurons. And it's especially toxic in motor neurons. So patients who have this excess of sorbitol and very high sorbitol levels do go on to develop the motor neuron disease that we call SORD deficiency. So what does this look like in terms of clinical presentation and diagnosis in real life? Patients with SORD deficiency typically present clinically to a physician in the teenage years with symptoms of axonal neuropathy. Those symptoms usually include slow running, difficulty walking, difficulty climbing stairs, and frequent tripping and falling. And because it's typically diagnosed in the teenage years, what we've heard very often from patients is that they notice in gym class or in sports that they're just not keeping up with the other kids. They're not running as quickly no matter how hard they try. They're falling behind when they're walking with friends or climbing stairs. And, very often, there's a lot of trips and falls because of ankle, foot, dorsiflexion or mobility. So, these could seem kind of, mild or vague, like early on. And a lot of patients actually, when they look back, say, I started to notice those symptoms when I was 12 or 13, but I didn't realize it was really, a serious medical problem. So once they're falling behind their peers, they're not, able to participate in sports, they're having difficulty running, walking, climbing up the stairs, they're typically referred to a neurologist who diagnoses them symptomatically, either with Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, usually type 2, or distal hereditary motor neuropathy. And prior to 2020, patients were just diagnosed symptomatically as having CMT2 or distal hereditary motor neuropathy of unknown genetic cause because, it didn't flag any of the genetic tests at that point. But there was a huge Nature publication by some academic researchers in the neuropathy space in May of 2020 that based on whole genome sequencing of patients with CMT2 and distal hereditary motor neuropathy of unknown genetic cause, they were able to identify the genetic cause of about 10% of those patients. And so we now know that about 10% of patients with CMT2 and distal hereditary motor neuropathy that was previously unknown genetic cause is really SORD deficiency. So there's now a genetic test that can definitively diagnose SORD deficiency. And we're also in the process of developing a sorbitol blood test as well. And we recently saw some interesting natural history data on patients with SORD deficiency. So because patients were previously classified as CMT2 or distal hereditary motor neuropathy of unknown genetic cause, many patients with SORD deficiency were, captured clinically and have been followed for quite a long time by their physicians. And this group of academic researchers recently presented some data on what they knew right now about their patients with SORD deficiency. And this helps to show us what the disease looks like in many patients, symptoms and disease progression. What we're seeing on the bottom of the slide is age. Oh, I see a little bit of this has been cropped, yikes. But on the bottom here, we're looking at 20 years old here, 40 years old here, 60 years old here. And so early on, like we just talked about, patients present in their teenage years and early 20s with difficulty running, difficulty walking, difficulty standing on heels and toes. And you might wonder what does that matter? But being able to flex your foot or flex your ankle really dictates balance, as well as ability to climb stairs and to do a timed up and go or sit to stand test, going from sitting to standing position. Many patients develop tremor. Only some patients develop upper limb involvement. So for the majority of patients with SORD deficiency, it actually is only a lower limb motor neuron disease. And there's upper limb involvement in hands and arms only in about 30% of patients. And when we look at the bottom here, talking about use of insoles and braces and use of a cane, this helps us to see the progression a little bit. So when patients are in their teens and 20s, that's when they're usually using insoles. It does then progress to leg braces or AFOs in their 20s and into their 30s. And then you start to see patients in their 30s and moving into their 40s, 50s who really require use of a cane or on this slide a stick. So it is a progressive disease. Patients do lose their ability to walk over time and do those daily tasks like climbing stairs, going from sitting to standing. So now we'll talk a little bit about a drug that we're developing for potential treatment of SORD deficiency. Again, I just want to highlight AT007 is an investigational drug. It is not yet approved by the FDA, but it is in clinical trials. We're actually in a phase 3 trial right now, which we'll talk about at the end of the webinar. So as we showed before, patients with SORD deficiency are missing the SORD enzyme. They build up very high levels of sorbitol in their blood and tissues. And our investigational drug AT007 blocks the enzyme aldose reductase that's responsible for conversion of glucose to sorbitol. So this is the enzyme that normally converts glucose into sorbitol, which then builds up. And if we block that enzyme, we can actually stop that conversion of glucose to sorbitol in the first place, so that even though patients with SORD deficiency can't metabolize sorbitol, it doesn't matter because we're not actually making sorbitol anymore. And this actually doesn't result in any adverse increase in glucose because our body is actually able to take that 1% of glucose and metabolize it through the other pathway. So when you block aldose reductase, glucose is just used by the hexokinase pathway for energy production. There is a very nice Drosophila or fruit fly model of SORD deficiency. I know it's funny for us to think about fruit flies as an animal model, but there's a lot of things that you can do with fruit flies that especially make them interesting to study for neurodegenerative diseases and neuropathies. As you can see on the right-hand panel here, Drosophila have a very highly organized neuronal system, which you can stain here with a fluorescent protein and really see the neurons and see if they're functioning appropriately and if they look healthy. So in Drosophila, researchers at the University of Miami knocked out the SORD gene, just like patients with SORD deficiency. And these fruit flies actually have high sorbitol levels, just like patients. And when you look at their neurons, they're actually degenerating. So neurons in the fruit flies form these black hole structures, which shows that their neurons are actually degenerating. And that's what's shown here by these arrows. And when we treat the fruit flies with AT007, we reduce the sorbitol level, and you also stop these black hole structures from forming so that their neurons are once again healthy. We also have cultured cells from patients with SORD deficiency. That's what's here on the left-hand panel. So you can see that this gray bar is the sorbitol level in cells from SORD deficiency patients. The sorbitol levels are very high versus the healthy volunteer controls. And when we treated those cells in culture with AT007, we really reduced the sorbitol levels quite significantly. So this led us to do the first clinical trial in patients with SORD deficiency. This is what we call a pilot trial or a small trial to see if the drug works the way that we hope it does before moving into a larger trial or phase 3 trial for potential approval. So we did this trial last year. We are very thankful to the SORD patients who participated in the study. They've really opened the doors for drug development for all patients with SORD deficiency. We treated 8 patients with SORD deficiency with AT007, and we looked at their sorbitol levels before we treated them and during the treatment with AT007. So what we're looking at here on the graph on the left-hand side is the gray bars, which are these patients' sorbitol levels before they were treated with the drug. So you can see that the range of sorbitol in these patients was very high, but it was also varied. So we had a few patients with lower sorbitol levels than the rest of the people, about 20,000, 25,000 nanograms per mil. And we had patients that went all the way up to 45,000 or 47,000 nanograms per mil. And the reason I mention that is because we have data in these patients and also in a larger group of patients showing that all patients with SORD deficiency have very high sorbitol levels compared to unaffected individuals. But within the group of SORD deficiency patients, there are some patients that have lower levels than others and some that have higher levels than others. And that seems to drive the severity and progression of the disease. So in this group of patients, those that had higher sorbitol levels, the ones that are 45,000, 47, 40,000, those are patients that had to wear leg braces at a very young age compared to the rest of the group. So many of these patients were wearing leg braces by the time they were 20. Were unable to climb stairs independently by the time they're 30. Really had a very aggressive presentation of disease. Patients with the slightly lower sorbitol levels, 25,000, 20,000, those patients were able to walk independently for longer, didn't require leg braces until a little bit later in life. We're still able to climb stairs independently at the age that we examined them. So everyone has high sorbitol, that's part of this disease, but we do know that sorbitol level does drive the disease severity. And why is that important? Because with AT007 treatment, we're reducing sorbitol levels. So it's important for us to know that sorbitol is driving this disease, and that how high or how low your sorbitol is makes a difference in terms of how quickly and aggressively the disease will progress. Really importantly, every single patient that we treated with AT007 showed a very substantial sorbitol reduction over a pretty short period of time. So the mean sorbitol reduction was 66%. The range was 54 to 75%. So every single patient showed a greater than 50% reduction. And for many of these patients, that was the difference between bringing them from the highest range to, a very low range, to not quite normal, but definitely getting there. So this was the basis of designing our phase 3 trial, which I'll show you in a minute. And the drug was in these 8 patients, generally safe and well tolerated. AT007 is a liquid suspension that you take orally. So it's a liquid once daily oral suspension. So we took that data, we met with the FDA, we designed a phase 3 trial that's intended to hopefully lead to approval of AT007 for SORD deficiency if the study is positive. So this study is ongoing right now. It's called the INSPIRE trial. It's a double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center study in approximately 50 patients with SORD deficiency, age 16 to 55. And the study is designed to look at two things, but all in one trial. So in the first part of the trial, we're looking at reduction of sorbitol level, just like we did in the pilot study. In this trial, we're looking at reduction of sorbitol after 3 months of treatment with either AT007, the active drug, or placebo. And the patients continue in the trial for up to 2 years, where we're following long-term clinical outcomes. So what are those clinical outcomes? We're looking at something called the CMT FOM, or the CMT functional outcome measures, muscle MRI, and the CMT high, or CMT health index, which is the patient reported outcomes index for CMT. So all of these tests are very specific for the CMT and hereditary motor neuropathy patient population. They were designed and developed by experts in CMT and HMN to be relevant in this patient population. The CMT FOM has what's called a lower limb domain, which is a combination of 3 things. A 10-meter walk run. So we have patients walk or run for a 10-meter distance as fast as they can, and we time it. So for some of the younger patients in the study who might not have a lot of disease progression, they are able to run 10 meters, and it usually takes them a few seconds, 2, 3, 4 seconds. For patients who might be a little bit more progressed, who are unable to run but can still walk, it takes them longer. And we do have some patients in the study that are very affected or later in their disease process, and they have to use leg braces or a cane to walk, and of course their walking speed will be much slower. So the primary clinical outcome for the study is 10-meter walk run, because we think that's a very good metric for what's wrong with patients in SORD deficiency, and an ability to measure how that deteriorates over a short period of time. The other pieces of the CMT FOM, specifically the lower limb domain, which we think is really relevant in SORD deficiency, is timed stairs. So how long does it take the patient to walk up 4 stairs? And also something called timed up and go, where a patient goes from sitting on a bench to standing, walks a few steps, and then goes back. So we have quite a few patients in this trial already. We've looked at their baseline data. So before they start treatment, they do all of these tests. And it does confirm that these are good measures for the SORD deficiency population. These tests do a really good job of assessing how severe the disease is. And then our hope is that treatment with AT007 will slow or stop disease progression in the patients that receive active treatment, and that their disease progression over the period of the trial will look very different from the patients who are on placebo. So in this trial, patients come in and they do all of the functional tests, 10-meter walk run, stair climb, sit to stand, and they fill out a questionnaire called the CMT high. We do all their blood tests. We look at sorbitol levels. We do a muscle MRI. And then the patients are randomized to either active treatment or placebo. And it's a 2-to-1 randomization, which means that 2/3 of the patients in the study will get the active drug and 1/3 will get the placebo. The reason we do it that way is so that patients, even though it's a placebo-controlled trial and we can't have everybody receive the active drug, there is a higher chance that you will receive the active drug than the placebo. We monitor patients at day 30, 60, and 90. And at 90 days or 3 months, we look at sorbitol reduction. And we're currently discussing with the FDA right now whether sorbitol reduction on its own could be a basis for a potential accelerated approval for SORD deficiency, because there are no drugs approved. But either way, patients continue on in the study, and we do these clinical outcome assessments: 10-meter walk, run, stair climb, sit to stand, all of the assessments at 12 months. And hopefully we'll hit statistical significance at 12 months. If not, the study continues to 24 months and all of those tests are performed again. So the total duration of the study is 24 months. We're hopeful that the data from just the biomarker portion might be acceptable for approval. We're, again, discussing that right now with the FDA. We'll know soon. But altogether, this is a pretty cohesive study that looks at the impact of AT-007 on biomarkers like sorbitol, but also on clinical measures of daily function. I think all the patients participating in this webinar probably know that, walking ability, how fast you can walk, how much balance you have, how easily you can walk without feeling like you might fall. Those are real life measures. Ability to climb stairs, to go from sitting to standing. These are things that we do in everyday life that have been validated from physicians and patients as being meaningful in terms of impact on daily life. As many of you may know, there is a network of centers called the Inherited Neuropathy Consortium Centers of Excellence. This is a group of really many of the top physicians in CMT and hereditary neuropathy in the country. Many of these centers are sites in our phase 3 trial. So the University of Colorado, University of Rochester, University of Iowa, University of Miami, University of Pennsylvania, and Mass General. And if the center that you typically go to is not a participant in our clinical trial, they certainly know about the study, and we're probably collaborating with them so they could refer you into one of the sites that is working on our clinical trial. This is an international clinical study, so there are sites in Europe as well. We are doing the study at University College in London in the UK, at a neurological institute in Italy, in Milan, and in Prague in the Czech Republic. So there are opportunities for patients who may reside in Europe. We have a website and some educational materials that are available on the INSPIRE clinical trial. If you're interested in learning more about the study, I can definitely answer some of your questions tonight. But there's also a website. The link is here. We'll put that into the chat as well. And there are many brochures that you can download on SORD deficiency as a disease state and also the clinical trial. So in the US, we're enrolling patients 18 to 55 with SORD deficiency. We're working with the FDA to try to open that up to patients under 18, potentially 16 and 17-year-olds. But right now in the US, the study's only open to 18 to 55. But outside the US at the EU sites, the study is open to patients age 16 years old to 55. We're very far along in our enrollment in this trial, which is great. We're really appreciative for all of the patients who are already participating, who are making the study possible. But that also means we're just at the end of enrollment. So this is the final call for enrollment. And if you've been diagnosed with SORD and you're interested in participating, please contact us on the sooner side, because the study will close once we hit full enrollment. And if you're interested, there's a very handy email that we have set up. It's SORD@Applied Therapeutics. And we can help refer you to one of the clinical sites that's participating and get you screened for the trial. What you see on the bottom of the screen here is a schematic of what the trial involves. It's a trial that goes for a period of 2 years, as we were talking about on the previous slide. But not all of the visits have to be at the site. We actually have home health visits where we can send nurses to your house to do blood draws and hopefully decrease the burden on patients of having to travel to the site so often. So just a quick summary of what this trial involves. Patients we'll typically have a home health visit to screen for the trial. We'll do blood tests and send a nurse to your home to make sure that you would qualify for the trial. And then you would actually travel to one of the clinical sites for a few days. It's usually 3 to 4 days to actually start the trial. And then after that, we can send a home health nurse to your house to do blood samples at day 30, 60, and 90. And then patients come back to the clinic every 6 months after that. So at month 6, month 12, month 18, and month 24, and that's when the trial ends. And we realize that patients don't often live in very close proximity to these clinical sites. We know that many of you may visit these sites because that's where your physicians are, but it's still a long trip for many patients. And so the trial does take care of all of the travel requirements, and we take care of getting everybody to the site. And there's obviously compensation for participating in the trial as well. So this is the last slide, and then we can move to Q&A. We get the question pretty often, what should I do if I think I have SORD deficiency? So if you received genetic testing prior to 2021, you wouldn't have been tested genetically for SORD because we didn't even know it was a thing back then. SORD was just identified as a genetic cause of CMT2 and HMN in May of 2020. So the genetic testing really only started in 2021. So if you had genetic testing before 2021, and it came back negative for everything, and you're still in the category of unknown genetic cause, it doesn't mean that you don't have SORD because there was no testing for SORD at that point. So your doctor can request a SORD genetic test from a number of commercial labs. One example is GeneDx. The test is an exome slice for SORD, and there's the test code. They can do this test with either a blood test or a buccal sample, which is a cheek swab. And these kits, especially the cheek swab kit, can even just be sent to your house. You swab your cheek, you put it back in a FedEx envelope and send it to them. So it does require a request for the test from either your physician or I'll refer you to the H&F to talk about this Genie program. But many patients who might have had genetic testing before 2021 haven't been tested for SORD. And so this is, I think, a pretty good opportunity for patients to find out if they might have SORD deficiency. We're testing patients for SORD deficiency in the context of screening for our clinical trial. As we said on the last slide, we're almost fully enrolled in that trial, so we won't be doing that screening forever. So if you're interested in screening for the trial and finding out if you have SORD, we can do that for another short period of time. After that, you'll want to ask your doctor to request a genetic test or to talk to the HNF about their Genie program, which I'll refer to them in a minute. One last note here, which I just learned in the last few weeks, is that many of these commercial labs that do genetic testing for SORD and for many other diseases actually keep your sample stored there so that you could do future genetic testing. So if you've had genetic testing in the past before there was a SORD genetic test, you might even be able to use the sample that's already sitting there at the lab. Your doctor would just need to reach out to the lab and say, hey, you tested a sample for my patient, 3 years ago. Can you rerun that sample now for SORD deficiency? So hopefully there's some simple processes here that can help patients get diagnosed if they think they have SORD deficiency. Again, this genetic disease is responsible for about 10% of patients with CMT2 and hereditary motor neuropathy. So that's a pretty sizable number. And I'll let the HNF talk more about their own program, but there is this CMT Genie program that the HNF has set up to help guide patients through how to get genetic testing for different forms of CMT, and SORD deficiency is one of them. So I think we could move over to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Shoshana. That's very exciting news, and it's great to see the progress that's being made and seeing more and more patients enrolled and engaging in this this fairly new conversation. We had some questions popping up here that I figured I'd field to you. The first one is from Kenneth. He says AT007 knocks out the AR, thereby stopping the glucose to sorbitol conversion. With this, we're no longer adding the sorbitol accumulation, but because there's a SORD total, how are sorbitol levels reducing?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. SORD, or sorbitol dehydrogenase, is the specific enzyme that our body has to metabolize sorbitol. But there's also other enzymes called scavenger enzymes that just generally break things down. They're not very effective, but they can break down other things, and sorbitol is one of them. So what we know so far from the animal models and from the pilot study patients is that the sorbitol that's already there and that's existing does eventually get broken down. It takes longer than if you had the sorbitol dehydrogenase enzyme. Some of it is actually broken down just into carbons and hydrogens and, kind of used for other things in your body. Some sorbitol is really removed from your body through the urine, through other filtering mechanisms. So you don't have another specific mechanism for breaking down sorbitol, but there's generalized ways that it can then come out of your body.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. We have a question here from Lisa. Her daughter was screened and tested last November and was invited to the trial at the age of 16. Before our first New Jersey site visit, we were told that she would need to be 18 before she participates. She is registered in the drug trial. Can she participate as soon as she turns 18 in July?
So that's a really specific question, but I think some of the general principles are relevant to the broader population. So in the US, so we had hoped when we started the trial, and our original plan was to include patients 16 to 55 in the US and Europe. And so that's actually how this patient was able to be screened at 16. When we finalized and actually started the study, the FDA did ask us to start with patients 18 and older in the US and then open it up at a later point to patients under 18. So that's how that situation happened. The 16-year-old, there were a few 16-year-olds who were actually screened. We know they have SORD. They would actually qualify for the trial if the trial in the US was open to under 18, which it's unfortunately not at this point. But we're working with the FDA to try to open it up to patients under 18 in the US. We had a few other patients that who actually turned 18 recently. And so we were able to bring them into the trial. We have one more turning 18, I think next week, that will come into the trial. So unfortunately right now we're stuck with 18 and over in the US. We are including patients 16 and over in Europe. And the reason that that's actually helpful for all of us is because it provides information on safety and efficacy in the 16 and older population. So while that doesn't help you if you have an under 18-year-old in the US right now, it does help everyone in the longer term when we think about, eventually potential drug approval and what does that look like and what does the treatable population look like. So The fact that we have 16 and older outside of the US, we're pretty hopeful that that will allow us to actually have a drug approved for treatment in, people 16 and older. But unfortunately, we can't have 16-year-olds in the trial right now, which I know is very disappointing and frustrating for families in the US. And we're working on it, but I can't guarantee that that will happen before the trial is fully enrolled.
Understood. And I'm assuming that also includes if you live in the US, you can't necessarily travel to Europe just to participate in the trial. You would have to be a resident. Okay, just clarifying that.
Unless you're an EU citizen of one of those countries, but
I know,
that's usually not the case.
As a parent, I understand you're
Yeah.
willing to do anything to help your children. So we hope we can get that to you as soon as possible. Is there an estimated time from when someone submits their sample for SORD testing to University of Miami to get the results back on whether they do have SORD?
That's a good question. So you're right. So prior to 2021, the only way to get tested for SORD deficiency was the University of Miami, which was the group that actually did the genetic testing for that Nature publication. But since then, there's commercial labs that have come out with their genetic tests, places like GeneDx, Invitae, I think there's another one called Athena. So through those companies, so my understanding is the University of Miami, it's an academic facility. They do a great job and we're collaborators with them on a lot of research programs, but they're not a high throughput genetics lab. So I don't know what their timeline is or if they're even still doing genetic testing, but I do know that you can submit genetic testing to one of these commercial labs and the turnaround is usually 4 to 6 weeks.
Okay, thank you. April, we will, H&F team will look into that as well. We have your contact information. So so how much longer is the trial enrolling? Is there a cutoff date?
Only a few weeks. Yeah, there's not a cutoff date. So when we hit the 50 patients that we need for the trial, then we'll close enrollment. So we do need some more patients. I know a lot of the patients in Europe are lined up. They've just not been brought in yet. So I think it's a matter of weeks, not months, that this trial is enrolling. We'll hopefully be, fully enrolled in October. And so please, I urge you, because we've unfortunately on some of our other programs had patients come once the study was already full and say, what, I was going to participate in it. So that's it's a difficult situation for all of us. We hate having to communicate that the trial is now closed for enrollment. So this is a situation where first people in, until we get to 50, that's who gets into the trial. So if you have SORD and you would like to participate in the clinical trial, please email us as soon as possible. It's sword@appliedtherapeutics.com.
Yes, and before we go on to the next questions, just as everyone's wanting to learn more, and if you're interested in filling out that contact form in the chat, there's also pinned to the top is the SORD page on the H&F website with a contact form you can fill out. We have our previous webinar on there as well as the Facebook group to help people connect to each other and just stay up to date with the updates and the new information. So feel free to click on that link as well. If you are a patient that received the placebo, how long will it be before they're able to get the active drug?
It's a good question. So there's, let me see if I can actually go back to that slide. So the way that this trial is designed, there's a 12-month clinical outcomes assessment. And so if we hit statistical significance at that 12-month point, then the study is completed and unblinded, and that's the end of the trial. And so the placebo patients at that point would cross over to active treatment. And we would also probably have another long-term follow-up trial where the patients who received active treatment could continue on active treatment. So the short answer is it could be as early as 12 months, and being on placebo for 12 months in the context of neurodegenerative, trials is not such a long period of time. If we don't hit statistical significance at 12 months, the study continues for another year to 24 months. So I think the shortest timeline that the placebo patients would be on placebo would be 12 months. The longest time period would be 24 months or 2 years. And the trial is designed so that placebo patients do have an opportunity to, quote, cross over to active and receive the active drug for the same period of time as the trial. So, I know sometimes it's hard for patients. I've been in this situation on the family side as well to say, gosh, I don't want to be in a placebo controlled trial. What if I get the placebo? But, it's number one, a way to really contribute something meaningful to the community. There's a 2-to-1 chance that you actually will get the active drug. So there's a much higher probability that you'll be on active versus placebo. And then if you are on placebo, it's for a relatively short period of time, hopefully 1 year, maximum of 2 years. And then you're guaranteed to get the active drug free of charge after that, as part of the clinical trial. So those are sort of the pros and cons.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you for that. If someone didn't make the trial, they didn't qualify for the trial, is it because they were negative, that their sorbitol levels weren't high enough? Does that automatically mean that they don't have SORD?
Yes. So there's a couple of ways that patients would not qualify for the trial. So number one, if you don't have SORD, so if your sorbitol levels are normal, that also means your genetic testing was negative for SORD. So the two always go together. Or, if patients are under the age of 18 in the US or over the age of 55, or, not between 16 and 55 in Europe, there's a theoretical, there's a possibility that if you have something else going on, like abnormal lab values from some other unrelated health problem that's not, CMT or SORD, that could also, sort of disqualify you from the trial, for lack of a better term. But we've had, I think, only one patient that I'm aware of on that front that's screened. And, the patients would be told if that's the case. So if anyone did not qualify for the trial, it's almost certainly because they don't have SORD.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Ken had another question. You had mentioned briefly that efforts are underway to make a sorbitol level blood test commercially available. Are you able to speak to this any broader?
Sure. So I love sorbitol as a testing mechanism. It comes back. So we do both in the context of screening for the trial and the clinical trial itself. So we will take a blood sample and run sorbitol levels on it. And then we also do a cheek swab for a genetic test. And the sorbitol levels are just always so clear cut. If you have SORD deficiency, your sorbitol levels are always above 10,000 nanograms per milliliter. And, it's a pretty accurate test. It's quick. It's a lot faster than genetic testing. So we usually get our sorbitol results back, within a week. The genetic testing is important to confirm, and also it's helpful sometimes to know what exact mutation you have, and is it the same mutation, is it different mutations, but that that testing takes 4 to 6 weeks, and it's a little bit more complicated. So in the context of the clinical trial, we're doing sorbitol testing, and we're working with Quest Diagnostics on adapting that to be a commercially available blood test, which will probably take several months to get transitioned over. But our hope is that at the point of completion of this trial, or a potential approval, to have a commercially available sorbitol test and just be able to walk into a Quest or, have your doctor draw a blood sample and send it there, I think would probably be, faster, a little bit easier in some ways. And it's just so clear cut when we look at the results, which is really helpful here.
Absolutely. And then we had some questions here. So just to reiterate, for anyone who is also looking for support from the H&F team and our newest program, the CMT Genie, Joy has pasted the link in the chat for everyone. It's cmtgenie.org. So that intro call, when you click on book a call with H&F, if there is potential there for SORD, we will ask you, some of those identifying questions, and we can connect you with Applied Therapeutics to go ahead and apply for the SORD testing through the trial, or we can screen for neuropathy panel through the cmtgenie.org and work with the Genome Medical and all of our virtual genetic counselors that we're connected with there as well. So if you're not sure where to start, please contact the H&F team either way. You can also email myself or Courtney, Estella, ESTELA @hnf-cure.org, or just click on that cmtgenie.org link and we can help set up that appointment for you. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. I really, really appreciate you coming on here and just updating us on this progress. It looks very promising. It's very exciting. I know the H&F team is doing everything we can to make sure that patients are finding you and the Applied Therapeutics team and qualifying for this trial. And we're really excited to see the results as they begin to be presented. And yeah, we really appreciate
it. And actually, if I could interrupt you for 1 second, I just want to say another huge thanks to the HNF and to all the patients that have been involved. This is truly an amazing effort that we've been able to move so quickly through the clinical process for SORD deficiency. So, just taking a step back, like no one even knew that this was a disease before May of 2020. And here we are 2 years later in a phase 3 trial that's almost fully enrolled. And that doesn't happen by accident. It's because there's foundations like the HNF that are already, so closely working with patients that are able to, get actively involved and really like hit the ground running, like you guys did, like immediately, like we have some sort of patients, how can we pull this together? I know that quite a few of our patients from the pilot study actually were referred from the HNF. So we're so appreciative and very, very thankful to the patient community for jumping in and doing a pilot study when patients had really only just received a genetic diagnosis. And then for all of the patients that, are finding out if they have SORD and if yes, participating in our clinical trial. So I just can't say thank you enough to the HNF and to the patient community. Just working in such partnership is what helps us get drugs through, in a time frame so that it's meaningful and it's actually happening like in our lifetime in a, period of time that makes a difference. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. It's a massive team effort, and we encourage everyone. That link to the SORD Facebook group is on that HNF SORD page as well. It's really great to connect with other members of the community and just kind of support each other throughout this journey and through the trial and answer any questions that you can. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining us, and please reach out to us with any further questions. And again, thanks for jumping on tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.